My name is Eric Sedati and I'm the Director of the Whitlam Institute. We have a very simple format this evening. Kevin will provide his presentation and speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, followed by Dr. John Hewson, who will provide a response, and then by Dr. McKnight, who will do similarly. After that, it's open to you all. So, without any further ado, Kevin Taft, as you would have realised from the introductions, comes with a very fine pedigree in a number of respects. Not only was he the leader of the Liberal opposition in the province of Alberta for some years, I think 3 elections, if I recall. Is that right? 2 general. And the depth of this challenge needs to be put in perspective, where I think that the Conservative government there has ruled for several decades. So it made the Menzies period look like a holiday over a long weekend compared to the situation in Alberta. Kevin himself not only is experience of a practicing politician, analyst, consultant, has a PhD in business from the University of Warwick, and has written 4 books, all of which in varying degrees are germane to this evening's discussions. Most particularly, his book of Follow the Money, Where is Alberta's Wealth Going? And Democracy Derailed, the breakdown of government accountability in Alberta. And these will inform, obviously, his discussions this evening. Kevin, welcome.
This is great fun for me, I have to tell you that. Thank you so much, Eric. And Anna Yateman, I don't know if people know Anna. The reason I'm invited here is because Anna and I met in Canada about a year ago and started talking, and she suggested I come and visit Australia. So thanks to both of you, to the Whitlam Institute and to the University of Western Sydney for giving me this real privilege to speak with you today. Now, Eric, you said 20 or 30 minutes. When you told me, you said I had 35 minutes. So, and, you know, given the themes I've been asked to discuss, 35 minutes doesn't feel very long to me. I hope it won't feel long to you either. This is my first visit to Australia, and I must say I'm impressed. I wish I were visiting more of it. I've been mostly in Sydney. I got up the coast to Gosford and Newcastle and spent a couple of days around Terrigal. And everywhere I've gone, it looks clean and prosperous and beautiful. It's a beautiful country. And the people have been wonderful. It's funny when you travel how sometimes tiny little details stick in your mind. When I travel, I like to watch people and to observe the flow of everyday life, because those details, well, they say a lot about a place. They can be kind of fun and amusing. Last Saturday, I was on a train in Sydney. It was late afternoon, and the train was halted when lightning struck the signal system. Does this happen often in Sydney? Anyways, it happened to our train last Saturday. So we sat there, and after about a 30-minute delay and an announcement from the driver, the passengers near me, it was kind of like there was some cosmic conductor out there saying, okay, everybody now. All the passengers around me pulled out their cell phones and they began phoning home to let people know that they were going to be delayed. Now, I didn't have anybody to phone. Nobody was waiting for me. So I just took the pleasure of what was going on in the car. And at one point, within 10 feet of me, I was simultaneously listening to 2 women right over there in the car speaking in English. One of them had a bad cold and was speaking very loudly. Immediately to my left, there's a gentleman on his cell phone very enthusiastically speaking in Italian, which I think Italian is always spoken enthusiastically. Right over here, a young university student was speaking in Chinese. And then immediately across from me, a woman who was covered from head to toe in this beautiful, bright orange and yellow burqa with a small child in a stroller was speaking in what I think was probably Swahili. It was like I was in the middle of this linguistic I don't know what the Australian term would be, a salsa, something that was spinning around. It was great. And then everybody finished at about the same moment. We all exchanged glances and looked at one another. And then people just politely helped one another off the train, giving an extra hand and some suggestions to the African woman with the stroller. And we each went our separate ways. Now, for me, as brief as that moment was, it was a wonderful 21st century moment, a convergence of technologies and cultures that was inherently civil and democratic. And it was impressive because it was completely routine. Other than this strange fellow from the frozen north, nobody else even paid attention to it. In our train car, humanity faced a tiny little problem, worked it through in 4 different languages, and then moved on. I love a place where those kinds of moments of unnoticed good sense and grace just come easily and often. Not everywhere in the world is like that, but obviously Australia is. Now, you came today not to hear about stalled train cars, but to hear me speak about climate change and carbon exports and democracy from my perspective in Canada. I'm going to start with the theme of climate change. The legitimate science is clear and conclusive. The burning of fossil fuels is releasing carbon into the atmosphere, which is causing the climate to change in ways that is going to be very disruptive. The basic physics of the effects of carbon in the atmosphere are understood. The theory is coherent and well developed, and the physical evidence confirming it comes from every corner of the planet. The verdict is in: there are not 2 sides to this issue anymore. The way I look at it, it would be astonishing if humans were not causing the climate to change, given that we burn over 85 million barrels of oil every day and about 8 billion tons of coal. That's 8,000 million tons of coal every year. It's got to have an effect. And climate change is not an issue that we can outwait. It is not going away. Quite the opposite, it's going to get more and more severe. The debates we hear today in Parliament and the media, no matter how loud they seem now and how tiresome they may already be getting, are only the earliest beginnings of what will be a process that will far outlast any of us in this room. That brings me to my second theme, carbon exports. Australia and Canada are 2 of the world's largest exporters of carbon in the forms of coal and oil and natural gas. And in both countries, our production is increasing. Australia is now the largest exporter of coal in the world, while Canada is one of the world's largest exporters of natural gas and has some of the world's largest oil reserves, which are being developed rapidly. Canada sells more oil and natural gas to the United States than does Saudi Arabia or anywhere else. By far, the largest portion of Canada's oil reserves are in the Athabasca oil sands, or Athabasca tar sands. How many of you have heard of that, the Athabasca tar sands? Several people, maybe half of you. Well, the oil there is found in a mix of sand and oil called bitumen. And bitumen, it's the crudest of crude oil. It actually has to be upgraded before it can even be refined. And that upgrading requires extra processing, which drives up carbon emissions and other pollution. Because the reserves in the Athabasca oil sands are so large and require so much more processing, their development has been particularly controversial. That's why you've heard of them, probably. But despite the controversy, production is rising quickly. Hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested, and they are earning a lot of wealth for Canadians, just as coal is earning wealth for Australians. But let's ask, at what cost? Canadians and Australians need to honestly confront the hazards that our countries are running economically, socially, environmentally, and politically by increasing our dependence on exporting carbon. It doesn't take a lot of research to realize that in Europe and in the US and in Japan and elsewhere, tens of billions of dollars a year are being invested in the biggest brains and the best labs to make carbon fuels obsolete. Far-sighted countries and corporations are aggressively preparing for a world beyond carbon. I don't know about Australia, but Canada is not. And then there are the moral the moral issues about carbon exports, the issues of right and wrong and good and evil that accompany the business of prospering from the sale of products that science quite clearly says are endangering the planet. Should we be doing that? We have to ask ourselves, what are the issues of moral responsibility around climate change? The answers aren't simple. We're all implicated. I flew in an aircraft to get here that burned tons of fuel. But we need to openly and vigorously debate those questions so that we can figure them out. And that then brings me to the third theme of my talk, which is democracy. I want to talk about the ways that the carbon industry can capture the political processes in a democratic society. I'm going to speak about the Canadian province of Alberta a lot, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. It's somewhat smaller than New South Wales. Its population is about 4 million and growing rapidly. Its two largest cities are Calgary and Edmonton, each with about 1 million people. Alberta, then, with a total population considerably less than Metro Sydney, owns some of the largest oil reserves in the world. Now, to put that in perspective, imagine, I don't suppose anybody here is from the city government of Sydney, but imagine if the city government of Sydney owned the world's third largest oil reserves, more than Iran or Kuwait or Russia. That's a lot of wealth for a small population. So, of course, the petroleum industry swings a lot of weight in Alberta. An impressive portion of it is headquartered there. It is sophisticated, and it is active way beyond our borders in oil and gas fields all around the planet. Now, Alberta's petroleum industry is not a monolith, and it is filled with wonderful, talented, good people. But in the end, its interests are consistent. Different individuals and groups within the industry have differing priorities and attitudes, but taken as a whole, the industry has clear and consistent interests, and it pursues those relentlessly. The defining interest, the fulfillment of its purpose, is to find, produce, and sell fossil fuels, i.e. carbon. Now, in 2008, there was a general election in Alberta. It was my second general election as leader of the opposition, so I had a very particular view, you might say right from the front lines of it, of what was happening. There were widespread calls among voters to slow the growth of the petroleum industry. The public was upset about a range of problems, including fracking and drilling for coal seam gas, which is an issue here now, water use, cancer rates, land reclamation, and all the major political parties, even including the governing Conservatives, were calling for a substantial increase in the royalties paid by petroleum companies. The election campaign alarmed Alberta's petroleum industry because they felt they had lost control of the agenda. They were used to getting their way, and at that point, they felt threatened. Well, when that election was over, and it didn't go very well for my party, certain groups and individuals in the industry vowed to take much greater control of democracy in Alberta, and they have succeeded notably. I'm going to tell you how, because I think it might be a cautionary tale for the carbon industry in Australia. Now, democracy doesn't just exist. It functions through a range of institutions such as political parties, the civil service, the media, and so on. And so influence over those institutions gives influence over democracy. I'll begin with what happened to political parties and the Alberta legislature. After the 2008 election, the industry, led by a group of its smaller companies, formed an organization Now, the oil industry, the slang term for the oil and gas industry in Alberta is the oil patch. I don't know if that term is used here. I don't know where it comes from. But the name they gave their organization was Protect the Patch. And this group, with its own website and its letterhead, I mean, it was a real organization, worked hard to build a new right-wing political party called the Wild Rose Party, which they named after our provincial flower. Members of this industry group were among the biggest fundraisers for the Wild Rose Party, shaped many of its policies, which are extremely friendly to the industry, provided organizational capacity, sat on the party executive, and provided 13 candidates for it in the following election, which was in 2012. This party could easily form the government in Alberta in 2016. At the same time, other industry groups maintained intense pressure on the governing party, who were and still are the Conservatives. The party leader, who was the Premier of Alberta and who had called for an increase in royalties in the 2008 election, was driven to resign by a campaign of constant subversion from within his own party. His successor, the current Premier, is an unrelenting cheerleader for the petroleum industry. So by the close of the 2012 election, which I didn't run, the petroleum industry had captured both the governing Conservative Party and the new official opposition Wild Rose Party. They had a stranglehold on the legislature. The debates that dominated earlier legislative sessions and elections largely disappeared because neither party would raise the issues. Now, this had one immediate effect. It had a direct result on the political media, whose job it is to cover political debates and what happens in the provincial legislature, like your state legislature. When it came to petroleum development and climate change, there were just fewer stories to present because fewer people in the legislature were talking about them. The Wild Rose Party, for example, never mentioned the connection between lower royalties and higher government deficits. Instead, they blamed students and teachers and nurses and sick people and so on for expecting too much from government. And the headlines reflected this. Most people, unless you're actually in politics, in that give and take with the media, don't appreciate how tightly the political coverage in the media is driven by what is said in parliaments and political parties. If debate in those forums gets choked off or redirected, the public discourse in the media does too, and public understanding suffers. This is particularly true these days when news organizations have fewer investigative reporters than perhaps ever. Now let's move on from politics to regulatory bodies. One of the key roles of government in a modern democracy is to regulate industries, partly to protect those industries from themselves, but mostly to protect the public interest. There are banking regulators and telecom regulators. It's hard to believe, but there are telecom regulators, there's regulators for every sector of the industry. Alberta set up its first energy regulator 80 years ago to protect the public from uncontrolled flaring of natural gas wells. If you see photos of areas of Alberta from the 1920s and 30s, just flames shooting out of the ground from companies that were just flaring off natural gas. Decade by decade, the province built up one of the most respected energy regulators anywhere. Well, in 2012, in this new era, the Alberta government passed legislation that drastically changed the regulatory processes for the petroleum industry. Among the biggest changes, it removed from legislation all reference to protecting the public interest. It's just gone. And it weakened the quasi-judicial arm's length nature of the regulator, making it more vulnerable to direct influence from the Minister of Energy. In addition, the entire cost of running the regulator was turned over to the industry, and the person named as its chairman is a former head of the industry's largest lobby group. Then, in a move justified, by that phrase you hear it so often, improving efficiency for industry, 150 environmental officers were transferred out of the provincial government Department of Environment into the new energy regulator. So the end result is that the primary regulator of the petroleum industry in Alberta has less responsibility to protect the public interest, is completely funded by industry, is chaired by a strong industry ally, and has been handed a large portion of the government staff for environmental protection. Well, now let's move from the regulatory body to the public service itself, in the form of the Department of Environment in Alberta. They were responsible for administering and enforcing Alberta's Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act and the Water Act. Petroleum companies pursuing projects need to apply for permits under these acts and undertake environmental impact assessments. Something like this will be very similar here in Australia. Then, persons who are directly affected by the proposed projects are allowed to intervene in the approval process in order to raise concerns and protect their interests. If you're putting an oil well next to my farm, I want to have a say in how that's handled. That's essentially what it amounts to. At least that's how it's supposed to work. A court case last year revealed a different story, as follows. In 2011, a petroleum company submitted a request to increase the capacity of its oil sands production. Two groups then applied to file a statement of concern as interveners about the plan, as the law very clearly allows. Public servants, not political officials, public servants in the Department of Environment, which administers the law, refused to consider this statement of concern and froze the groups out of the entire process. So the groups, and there's some lawyers here, you'll be happy to hear this, those groups took the department to court. Well, the court's decision was a sharp rebuke of the department, quoting at length from internal government correspondence that came up in the trial. The court found that the department had denied these groups their right to intervene, not on the basis of law, but because the groups were known critics of the oil sands industry and hadn't cooperated with the oil sands industry. The court concluded that the Department of Environment had violated the very legislation it was meant to uphold. Now, to me, this is clearly about officials in the Alberta government, Alberta public servants, ignoring the rule of law to benefit petroleum development. We're going to move on. One by one, I'm taking you a tour of the institutions of Alberta. Another vital institution to modern democracy are universities. That's why we're here today. And sure enough, in Alberta, there have been a number of troubling controversies involving universities and the petroleum industry. I'm just going to tell you about one. The School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, which is a major public university, was set up after that 2008 election that troubled the petroleum industry so much. It was given $1 million founding donation from Imperial Oil, which is Exxon's affiliate in Canada. And the position of chair of the school was endowed by one of Alberta's most senior oil executives. The school has since then had huge success in fundraising. Eric should only be so lucky. The person who heads up the School of Public Policy is an economist and tax analyst. He publishes papers under the University of Calgary banner and frequently appears in the media as an expert on topics including corporate taxes and royalty systems. That's fine, but here's my concern. The same professor, the head of this institute, is also on the board of Imperial Oil. And if you read Imperial Oil's 2012 annual report, you'll see that he is paid $200,000 a year to serve on their board and has accumulated $1 million worth of Imperial Oil shares. In return for these benefits, like all their board members, he is obligated to advance the interests of Imperial Oil. Think about this. Given the legal obligations on members of the board of Imperial Oil to serve their corporate interests, what does this indicate about the independence of the university and of work published under its name? Or is the public just to assume that the interests of Imperial Oil and the interests of the university are one and the same? Now let's move to a topic closer to home, this firm, the courts. The courts. In Alberta, provincial judges are appointed after being approved by 2 different committees. Most jurisdictions in Canada, it's 1. In Alberta, we especially have 2 committees. The first committee is comprised of people who occupy top judicial and legal positions in the province, such as the deans of the 2 law schools, the chief justice, the head of the law society. The second committee has 8 of its 11 members, handpicked by the justice minister, and this committee makes the final recommendation to the minister who should be appointed as judges. Now, among its members who have overt political ties is its chairman, who was the official agent for the premier in the last election. His fields of law are oil and gas transactions, regulatory issues, and royalty matters. Now remember, the nominees approved by his committee become the judges who will eventually hear cases on land claims, environmental law, labor cases, and so on. Where will those judges stand? Why does Alberta need this second committee? This situation came to my attention last year after concerns were raised publicly about political meddling in the appointment of judges by none other than Alberta's former Chief Justice. Now listen, there are many other examples. I haven't said anything about the community charm campaigns by the petroleum industry. For instance, 10 years ago, there was a lot of discontent with the industry among farmers. There were confrontations. There was even a fatal shooting when a farmer shot an oilman on his land. Well, things are a lot quieter now. In my most recent conversation with a farmer about the petroleum industry, the farmer sang its praises because an oil crew had taken a few hours to repair the old gate on the country cemetery and to patch a public road the oil crew often used. Now, how can't you like an industry that does that? My list of examples has been long, and yet it is just an introduction. Political parties, government, the legislature, political media, the regulator, universities, the courts, the institutions of democracy. In effect, the petroleum industry has captured the political and economic agendas in Alberta by capturing the means through which those agendas are set. Debate originating within Alberta about carbon development has been quietened at a time when you would expect it to be getting louder. But there is an important caveat. Debates that originate outside Alberta about developing, for example, Alberta's oil sands are intense, and they are loud, and they are effective. People with climate change concerns in other parts of Canada, in the United States, and in Europe are taking up the issues. Movie stars are appearing on YouTube, celebrities are protesting, environmental and Aboriginal groups are preparing court actions to block developments. Powerful American business leaders, this is really interesting, powerful American business leaders who are not tied to the carbon industry are urging President Obama to refuse the XL Keystone pipeline, which will run from Alberta's oil sands down into the US. All of that washes back into Alberta, keeping relentless pressure on industry and governments to raise their performance. The way I think of it is that when it comes to the petroleum development, democracy in Alberta has been outsourced. And to be honest, I say that with real regret. Years ago, I read a definition of the term public relations that has stayed with me. It was offered by a renowned expert. Public relations, he said, is the staging of circumstances so that a particular outcome is more likely without having those circumstances appear to be staged. In other words, the best public relations are invisible. To the ordinary observer, things just happen in a particular way because, wow, that's how it is. The farmer, feeling good about the oil company who repaired the old cemetery gate, has no idea that the professor commenting on the radio that royalties need to be reduced is being paid handsomely by an oil company. The voter casting a ballot has no idea that the political party she likes has a president who owns a petroleum company. The elected official supporting an environmental bill doesn't realize that the regulations under that bill will be drafted by a team including people from the industry. To citizens living busy lives like most of us are and trying their best to figure out climate change, there are no visible connections whatsoever among repairs to the cemetery gates, the professor on the radio, the grant to the university, the lobbyist speaking on the TV news, the rise of a new carbon-friendly political party, and the regulatory ruling approving more carbon developments. But in truth, they are all connected. They're connected by a web of carbon. Now, not every example I've listed above was part of some premeditated conspiracy. But when a dominant industry with singular interests feels threatened, and the carbon industry is threatened by the issue of climate change, or when an industry just wants more, it can organize a campaign and sustain a mindset that, once mobilized, sweeps up far more than anyone initially expected. In these situations, actions, once launched, do not need to be consciously coordinated by a conspirator. They start to happen in concert because the interests and the mindsets are widely held. Those interests become part of a culture. A broad social consensus takes hold that can engender an expectation to conform, which maybe can be likened to a kind of groupthink. In Canada, this is spreading from the Alberta government to the federal government. Prime Minister Stephen Harper is from Alberta and has many supporters among both the Wild Rose Party and the Alberta Conservatives. His government has stifled science, laid off scientists, closed labs, closed libraries. Sound familiar? I've read a few stories about that here. And that government is pushing hard to expand carbon exports. But the reality is that in many parts of Canada outside Alberta, his agenda is running into resistance that could cost him dearly. Well, that's the picture as I see it from Alberta and Canada. You're going to have a chance in a few minutes after we hear from David and John to ask me questions or ask us questions. I'm going to leave you with some questions of my own. How much of what I have described in Alberta applies to Australia, or at least to some states in Australia? It seems to me, having spent a couple of weeks here, that the resolve of Australian governments and political parties to seriously address climate change and carbon emissions is weakening, even as the science gets stronger. Ask yourselves, why? Is this just happening? Or has the carbon industry and its allies here pulled off the same kind of success that their counterparts in Alberta and Canada have? To what extent has the carbon industry here entangled both the government and the opposition parties? How genuinely independent are Australia's regulators, agencies, and civil servants? You assume they are. Do you know? Are universities getting major funding from coal and petroleum companies? What are those companies getting in return? If your answer to some of these questions has been yes, then my last question to you is this. What are you going to do about it? Because the science is clear. The long-term future of this magnificent country and of so much more is at stake. Now, some people feel democracy is too fragile, weak, and slow to respond to serious threats. I believe the opposite. Democratic societies in times of crisis tend to prevail and then to emerge from the crisis strengthened. It is from democracies that the solutions to carbon emissions are already emerging. In Canada, the province of British Columbia, where Vancouver is, the west coast province of Canada, British Columbia introduced an extremely successful, wait for it, carbon tax in 2008. Carbon emissions there have fallen 10%. The economy has grown. And what might be most interesting if you spend time in British Columbia is that it has become fashionable to reduce emissions. The norms there are starting to change. In Ontario, Canada's industrial heartland, the portion of electricity generated from coal 10 years ago was 25%. Next year, it will be zero. Every coal-fired power plant will have been closed. And even bigger breakthroughs are happening in Europe and the US and Japan. Climate change will force us to alter the ways we live, the things we value and the things we condemn, the products we produce and the products we consume, and the actions of our governments. A few decades from now, our lives are going to be very different from today. Whether this transformation is clumsy and painful or uplifting and inspiring as it could be, depends on the health of our democracy. The more vigorous our democracy, the more resilient, creative, and adaptive our society. And adapt we must. Thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you very much. It's an unsurprisingly sober picture at one level, but I have to say that the suggestion of the strength of democracy and the rigour of democracy is a heartening thought, and I tend to share your optimism. I've got a number of questions, but I won't start them now. We'll wait till the time comes. I'd like to invite the first response from Dr. John Hewson. John, of course, is no stranger to anyone in this room. I noticed I think it was on your website, John, that you suggested you've had 4 careers as an economist, businessman, political advisor, and politician, and in the media as a columnist and commentator. John certainly has been a key player in a number of the developments and policy debates around the country, but it's perhaps less known for the work he's been doing in recent years, I'd have to say, around really practical responses to changing the investment structures around environment and environmental investment, which is some really quite exciting work that's being done by John and others in that area. But for this evening, please welcome John Hewson.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. And Kevin, congratulations. A very, very instructive speech, a very alarming speech in many ways if you think about how insidious that process can become. I represented a Conservative party. I'm a small L Liberal in a large L Liberal party. So it's sometimes difficult to speak your mind in those circumstances. But I remember back, you talk about political constituencies for change. I remember in the 1993 election, which I too lost, I took an objective on climate change to cut emissions by 2020 by 20% off a 1990 base. And today the debate is whether we can cut 5% off a 2000 base. How much the debate has shifted over that time. I was very pleased in the sense when Kevin Rudd won a huge mandate in 2007 to respond substantively to climate change. He's going to ratify Kyoto, which the Howard government refused to do. And he then had a very clear-cut agenda to have the Garneau report, a green paper, a white paper, the legislation, and if that didn't work, through the Parliament, a double dissolution, and we'd get an emissions trading scheme as a price on carbon, as a fundamental response to the whole process of responding adequately to climate change. He started at that time, I think, with as the poll suggested, a constituency of about 75% of the Australian people who supported that sort of strategy. Today, unfortunately, after the debacle of failing to have the double dissolution, then losing the Prime Ministership, and the Liberal leader losing his leadership on the basis of the same issue and a significant drift, that number today is around 30 to 35% of the Australian people who think we should respond urgently to climate change. And in fact, you notice quite a significant shift in public commentary by some of our political leaders, or ex-political leaders. I note most notably John Howard recently in a speech in London to a Nigel Lawson, can't say climate deniers organisation, but near to it, where he said that as far as he was concerned, he remained an agnostic on climate change, and that he didn't choose to believe the significance of the issue. And it's not a matter of religion, and it's not a matter of belief or instinct, as the word he used. In fact, he said he preferred to rely on his instincts. The science, as Kevin says, is in. It's definitive. When 97% of peer-assessed climate scientists say it's a problem, and say it's an urgent problem, and say it's a problem that's slipping away from us because globally we're not responding to it, it's a matter of fact. It's not a matter of religion. It's not a matter of instinct. And yet our debate in this country has shifted so far away from where it could have been 4 or 5 years ago. And I find that quite frustrating. We now have a situation where, of course, the Abbott government is abolishing the so-called carbon tax, which was a pretty disastrous process initiated by the previous government. The idea of putting a price on carbon has slipped back quite some distance, even though the Howard government actually, in Howard's time, did have an emissions trading scheme as one of its platforms at one of its re-election campaigns. But as he has now admitted, he changed his position on the issue to suit the short-term political circumstances as they unfolded, which I found, again, pretty offensive. Anyway, it's easy to get despondent in that sort of climate, and when you look at the way democracy has been eroded in Alberta, you do see signs of it occurring in Australia. I mean, the big polluters, or the carbon lobby, is pretty powerful. And if you look at the experience of the Howard government and the experience of the Rudd government and the experience today, they've been able to extract some pretty substantial concessions from government. Free permits, for example, I think under various versions of the emissions trading scheme under governments of both persuasions, is a good example of how much influence they've actually had. And of course, where the debate sits today, you can't see that there will be a resurgence of political leadership on this issue in this country for quite some time. Eric mentioned one of the things that I've been involved in recent years is something we call the Asset Owners Disclosure Project. Rather than give up on the issue of getting a substantive response to climate change, we decided to look at the issue from another perspective. And that's from the point of view of investment. I mean, if you want alternative technologies, renewables, energy efficiencies and so on, which should be a fundamental part of the response to climate change to be developed, they're going to need to be funded. They're going to need to be invested in and developed. I ran for a few years a group called the National Business Leaders Forum on Sustainable Development. We brought Al Gore to Australia about 8 years ago. He was dispensed with at the time as a failed politician and a mere entertainer, but he did give a speech on our behalf, which was in essence an inconvenient truth, and we urged him to get it out in whatever form he could to try and contribute to the global debate. But our aim in that organisation was to try and educate the business community beyond the carbon lobby of the tremendous business opportunities that would exist, including in terms of new businesses, new employment, new opportunities, new profit streams and so on, from a substantial and effective response to climate change. I got frustrated because most of the time I was chairing the group, we met among ourselves, even when Al Gore was here. The business community wasn't all that interested in it, and they didn't think about what you could do. So I started a series of businesses myself that actually demonstrated that you could make a quid, in quotes, out of responding sensibly to climate change. We built the first household garbage recycling plant at Eastern Creek and demonstrated that you could take 100% of the methane gas out of garbage before it was dumped in the ground and turn it into electricity to run the plant and sell the rest into the grid, an income stream and a substantive response to climate change. Another company, we built the largest biodiesel plant in the world in Singapore. I launched an energy-efficient light bulb company, which is still flourishing, a green data centre business. I mean, these just make the points that you can actually respond substantively to climate change. But in all those experiences, the one restraining factor was getting investment to fund them, getting people, venture capitalists, adventure capitalists, whatever way you want to describe them, to put up the monies to say this is worth pursuing. So this Asset Owners Disclosure Project has decided to focus in on the investment dollar. And what we do is work, in a sense, top-down and bottom-up on the big asset owners of the world, pension and superannuation funds, university endowment funds, sovereign wealth funds of individual companies. The top 1,000 of those account for over $70 trillion worth of investment funds globally. But the alarming feature is they invest about 55% of that in carbon-exposed industries, and only 2% of that $70+ trillion in low-carbon intensive industries. So if you think about it, if you could get that 2% up to 5 or 6%, you'd have enough funds globally to fund that what I think should be a technological revolution in renewables and energy efficiencies and low carbon intensive activities, such that you could make a substantial contribution to solving the problem of climate change. And what those asset owners are doing is in fact taking a 25-to-1 punt against a catastrophic climate event, which might strand some of the assets that they've invested in, the fossil fuel intensive investments that they're invested in, that might see those share prices fall, might see those property values fall, and so on. And so they are, in just simple portfolio terms, running a risk that is enormous. And in normal circumstances, the boards or trustees of those pension and superannuation funds and so on would not be meeting their fiduciary responsibilities by running that sort of risk when they are required under their mandates to maximise the return to the individual members of pension and superannuation funds over their working life. And so I think it's an interesting way of challenging those institutions to think about that asset allocation, if you like, that investment strategy. Not asking them to do anything more than you would normally do if you were sitting on a board there and saying, what sort of risks are we running by investing in different assets in different parts of the world. But they're big mobilisers of funds, as I say, $70 trillion US. They own, in effect, more than 50% of all the listed companies and all the stock exchanges of the world. They're in a powerful position to change corporate behaviour and in investment behaviour, and in response, I think, drive a process of change on climate change that is beyond government and doesn't rely on democratic processes, doesn't rely on the sort of normal constraints that Kevin has emphasised in his remarks. That's our top-down approach, to survey these institutions, these asset owners, and to rate them. We survey them on how they're managing climate risk, and we rate them on how they're investing those funds. They have to answer specific questions about why are they so heavily exposed, for example, to carbon-intensive industries in that investment strategy. At the same time, we're working on a bottom-up strategy. So we have a social media platform called The Vital Few, which empowers individual members of, say, superannuation and pension funds to write to their boards and ask them, how is it you're managing climate risk? Why are you taking such a big risk? And then in terms of most board processes, you get 5 of those coming into a board meeting. The board needs to consider the response in terms of a proper exercise of their fiduciary responsibilities. Of course, we've got a lot of pushback from this. A lot of these institutions don't believe that they should actually be declaring any of this. And some of them, of course, quite a lot of them are choosing not to respond to the survey. But we're still nevertheless rating them. And it is having the effect of embarrassing some of them into recognising the risks they're running and to change their investment behaviour. CalPERS, for example, the largest pension fund in the United States, has just come on board, and that in itself is driving a lot of others in the industry to say, boy, we should be doing something substantive about this. And, you know, there is an element of hypocrisy in their pushback to us, because in many cases when they invest in an individual company, they demand information from that company on the climate risks that they're running, on the carbon intensity of their activities and what they're doing about managing climate risk. So I'm thinking of a new index, not just the rating, but also a hypocrisy index, which draws attention to the comparison between the standards they demand on transparency and accountability of some versus the way they behave in terms of their own activity. So I think, you know, while it's easy to get despondent, I think, about the way this debate has gone, not just in Australia, but globally. And, you know, we're all looking around for some substantial leadership from somebody like Obama that might actually change the whole process, the whole momentum, the whole attitude globally. And he said he will, but I mean, it's very difficult when Congress is not prepared to go with you. You know, while in those circumstances it's easy to get despondent, I think there are things we can be doing, because as Kevin said, and one of the things I did agree with our previous Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, it is the moral challenge of this century, as well as the most important economic, social and political challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. We'll keep moving at this point. David McKnight is currently Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales and the author, again, of 4 books on topics diverse as contemporary politics, the news media, recent Australian history and international espionage. David's most recent book, I think it's your most recent, is the book No Coal. So that's one reason for asking him here this evening. The second, though, is that common across all of his work, I think, is a fine journalistic eye as well as an academic sense on the way the government operates and the ins and outs, the intricacies of government practices, a skill that is very valued in this current debate. David McKnight.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Kevin, and thanks, John. I really enjoyed both your speeches. Last year, the World Bank issued a report on climate change called Why a 4-Degree World Must Be Avoided. The bank pointed out that even if the current pledges by different countries to reduce carbon emissions were fulfilled, we're on track for a world 3 degrees warmer. If the pledges are not fulfilled, which of course is you could even say perhaps likely, we're on track for a 4 degrees of warming, and which might arrive as possibly as early as the 2060s. This is not a world we would enjoy living in. The bank referred to unprecedented heat waves, severe drought, major floods and sea level rises. The bank made the additional point, often forgotten, that 3 or 4 degrees is not an end point. One doesn't arrive at a certain point and then stop. Rather, at some point one passes a tipping point and keeps going. At that point, scientists tell us, changes simply cascade out of control. The World Bank didn't mention another aspect which is also forgotten, because when we talk, and I'm like everybody, you talk about heat or floods or yada, 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 it's a kind of abstraction, but a much warmer world will produce things that are very human, very concrete. Large-scale refugee movements, the depopulation of agricultural areas struck by droughts and floods, the likely outbreak of wars, local wars, the spread of authoritarian rule, and other forms of social breakdown. That's what a warm world or a much warmer world means, not those abstractions, I think. And this is what I think people mean when they talk about catastrophic climate change. For some time now, many people have agreed that one of the things we have to do is to reduce our use of coal, and that was the book I most recently wrote, Big Coal. But we haven't reduced our use of coal, far from it. The world is binging on coal. Global coal production has risen around 4% on average each year since 1999. And what that means is that between 2000 and 2008, global greenhouse emissions rose 30%. They didn't fall, they didn't level off, they rose 30%. I think there's a sort of feeling amongst some people that somewhere, somehow, someone is doing something about all this, and that we're kind of getting close to dealing with the issue. Some people, perhaps not us. But emissions are rising, they're accelerating. So everyone talks about climate change, but effectively very little is being done. In fact, on the numbers, we're going backwards. Many people still talk about the threat of climate change as if it's something just over the horizon, but the changes are happening before our eyes. The most dramatic evidence is the rapid shrinking of the once vast Arctic ice sheet. In the northern summer of 2012, the size of the Arctic ice sheet shrank to its smallest on record. Scientific forecasts previously predicted that the Arctic could be free of ice in the summer of by around 2050, free of ice in the summer. But the current melting lends weight to the most pessimistic analyses, which say that this may occur by the end of this decade. So we're already well on the way to changing one of the largest physical features of the planet. And it's a feature which plays a big role in oceans and the circulation of ocean currents and the world's weather. The skeptics, of course, like to point out that air temperatures have plateaued. What they don't say is that the temperature of the oceans is still rising, and the shrinking of the Arctic ice may well be one of the consequences of this. But throughout all this debate on climate change and what to do about it, one factor is ignored, it seems to me, perhaps not ignored tonight. The factor is the role of fossil fuel corporations. And it was because of that absence that I decided to write the book Big Coal. My conclusions from writing the book are perhaps not surprising. The global coal industry is now doing everything it can to make sure that world demand for coal will grow strongly in the future. They're really putting an effort into it. They are determined to advance their material interests regardless of any other consideration. And they've been doing this since the dangers of climate change were first talked about and there was first global action or decision-making in the early 90s. They're doing this right in Australia right now, and they've been doing it for some time. Under the Howard government, the fossil fuel corporations lobbied successfully to prevent that government from doing anything substantial on climate. And you can read about how they did that in a book by the former Liberal advisor Guy Pearce, who was one of my co-authors on Big Coal. After the election of Kevin Rudd, the fossil fuel corporations vigorously fought the proposed emissions trading scheme. They produced TV ads saying that more than a dozen coal mines would close, and thousands of jobs would be lost. And their campaign was one of the factors that meant that emissions trading scheme was weakened so much that it failed to get support and eventually was dropped by Rudd. 2 years later, the Gillard Labor government introduced a carbon tax. Once again, the coal industry cranked up a scaremongering TV campaign about mine closures and job losses, and in the end it did succeed in weakening the carbon tax, but it didn't kill it. So when we talk about action on climate change and we talk about policy about climate change, fossil fuel corporations and their supporters are powerful factors in the debate, perhaps the most powerful single factor. And these companies are making investments now for the next 20 or 40 years. How do they justify it? If you push them, big coal companies justify their stance by referring to carbon capture and storage. This is the idea that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases can be captured from power plants and buried in underground reservoirs, natural reservoirs, which do exist. And the idea of carbon capture acts as a sort of great escape hatch, a get-out-of-jail-free card that allows the coal industry to keep on digging up and burning coal forever, they think. The trouble is that it's an illusion because it is impractical, expensive and unnecessary. But just to give you one example of it, carbon dioxide produced in power stations in New South Wales would have to be piped almost 1,000 kilometres down to the Victorian coast because this is the closest place where there is a suitable geological formation to store gas. And that gas would have to stay there till the end of time in the reservoir. As former Premier Bob Carr said, we should stop wasting time and money on this idea of carbon capture and storage. All of this brings me to the question of what to do. There are many things you could say in response to that question. Everybody wants to know, what can I do? What can we do? I just want to say one thing which I don't think has had much airtime. The determination and the influence of fossil fuel corporations is the underlying factor which few really want to talk about in the climate debate. And when you're dealing with raw power, you need a counterforce to defeat it. You can't defeat a force like the coal and oil industry unless you mobilise, in my view, a counterforce in society. What you need, in my view, is a broad and active movement of citizens who are prepared to take public action in the streets, some of whom may even be prepared to engage in civil disobedience. When the world wanted to prevent nuclear war in the 1980s, such a movement emerged, and it contributed to preserving the world from a catastrophic nuclear war. At other times in recent history, the emergence of mass movements have been crucial to carry through social change. I think there's very large numbers of Australians still, from right, from left and in between, who are genuinely alarmed about climate change. And given the right conditions, I think it's quite possible to build a broad mobilisation to demand real action on climate change. But one thing I know is for sure, without such a counterforce in some form or other, maybe not exactly how I'm projecting it, but without some sort of political counterforce, I don't think political parties and governments will be able to really develop the kind of policies we need to deal with what I believe is the greatest threat that modern humanity faces. Thank you.
David, thank you very much.